In this section, we're moving on to Agile methods, defining them, essentially highlighting what are the characteristics of this broad collection of disciplines that we talk about as Agile software development. Of course, this started in the late 90s, mostly to address the fast-paced, rapidly changing market. That owes a lot to both the development of the internet and the development of new techniques for hardware design, making customer changes to software systems much more rapid. Changing requirements happen all the time, but in this particular time period, we were seeing crazy amounts of change because the whole domain was changing, the environment was changing around customers, and something they may have wanted at the beginning of the year would have been obsolete if it had been deployed at the end of the year. So they had to change requirements. And this really called for small co-located software development teams to address the problems that waterfall and large upfront designs were seeing when applied to this methodology. Because you could define all your requirements the first 3 months of the year, but then in the implementation phase, the last 6 months of the year, it would be very difficult to make that sort of thing make sense. The sort of common sense piece was missing. So most of the Agile methods were developed initially by practitioners rather than academics or managers. And the Agile Manifesto is often viewed as the best, most definitive statement of what Agile methods are. But one thing tends to get lost when people talk about the Agile Manifesto. They unequivocally state in the Agile Manifesto that there is value in both the boldface and the parenthetical statements, but that Agile processes prefer the boldface statements over the parenthetical statements. So you would read parts of the Agile Manifesto as saying that you'd prefer to have the ability to adapt and respond to change rather than a requirement to follow a plan. That's not to say that plans are bad. It's just to say that in a rapidly changing environment, adaptation is better, right? Similarly, you'd prefer people and interactions rather than processes and tools. Not to say that tools or processes are bad, but just that people are able to deploy common sense, whereas a process isn't. Interacting with stakeholders is a better way of doing development than just letting the tool drive the development, because they're going to have a better sense of what the requirements are than the tool will. The Agile Manifesto also highlights working code as a preference over comprehensive documentation. Documentation can be out of date, both in terms of not being up to date with the domain, but also not matching the actual working code. And so therefore, for decision-making purposes, you want to focus more on the working code than on the documentation where possible. Again, that's not to say documentation is bad for large, complicated specifications, like, for example, the USB specification. Good documentation is invaluable, but most of the time, working code is actually a better thing to use for making decisions. And then finally, the Agile Manifesto preferences customer collaboration over negotiation. In a collaboration, you both have ownership and autonomy to make decisions. In a negotiation, you have to define things in such a way that were there a lawsuit or were there some kind of dispute, you would be protected. And I think collaboration is, in general, also preferred for waterfall development mechanisms as well. That said, there are environments like procurement of government systems where they kind of have to be negotiated up front just because of the way the purchasing works. So it's not to say that it's impossible to do good software development with negotiation, just that in an Agile approach, you would prefer customer collaboration. All right, so we're going to go through the 12 principles outlined in the Agile Manifesto on 4 slides, 3 apiece, and I'm just going to highlight a few things about them. This is not good. Let me see if I can correct this so that, oops. There we go. There we go. All right, 12 principles for software development. To make sure that we are going through all of them, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of these. So the highest priority in Agile software development is early and continuous development of actual software. This is where the notion of a minimum viable product comes from, because you want to launch as soon as you have anything that's remotely valuable so that you can start reviewing it and seeing if it works. The Agile Manifesto welcomes changing requirements even late in the process because it is a competitive advantage to be able to respond quickly to customer needs. The Agile Manifesto focuses on working very frequently to deliver software updates, possibly an iteration as short as just a week, sometimes a couple of weeks. Those shorter time scales give you more opportunities to integrate or interoperate collaboratively with your stakeholders. If, on the other hand, you define something that's going to take 2-3 months before you get customer feedback, things may have changed and you wouldn't have an opportunity to welcome those changing requirements. Agile principles 4 through 6. And I should also highlight, I think the bold-faced ones are the ones that most people think of when they think of Agile. So the first 3, everybody thinks of as Agile. And then the ones that are not, that don't have any boldface, they're not often thought of as like the most important piece of the Agile process. And sometimes, depending on which system you're in, people will omit them. I don't know if that truly qualifies as Agile or not, but you may actually see people omitting some of this stuff. So in number 4, business people and developers working together daily throughout the project. That is a principle of Agile development, but it does not often happen in many things that you would think of as Agile. 5, build projects around motivated individuals. Motivation is, of course, critical for success, and Agile incorporates that as an official part of the process, trying to make sure that individuals are motivated, that no one is stuck, that no one is frustrated, that no one is trying to do something that is basically tilting at windmills. 6, the most efficient and effective method is a face-to-face conversation. Again, this is de-emphasized in some respects in Agile processes for remote collaboration in ways that are sometimes good, sometimes bad. It is still one of the Agile principles listed in the Agile Manifesto, that face-to-face conversations in a development environment are best. 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. I think everyone who does Agile would agree with this. The rubber meets the road when you have actual code and you have some product to play with. 8, processes promote sustainable development. Essentially, we want to make sure that everybody in the picture is able to maintain the pace they're currently working at. This is an attempt to kill the sort of mushroom method piece where people aren't entirely sure what happens, and so everyone just is running as fast as they can all the time, or to kill the crunch that happened famously in a lot of software development cycles to try and compress a waterfall method into as short a period of time as possible so that not that much change has happened since you defined the initial requirements. That is not sustainable, and it is very, very difficult for the developers to do as a career. You might be able to do it for one project, but doing that every single time you have to build software is very painful. 9, continuous attention to technical excellence, and this is a really critical piece of the Agile process. They believe very sincerely that this leads to not just a better process, but also better product, better like code, better understanding of the domain. Another way to read this is to say this is all about eliminating the mushroom method entirely, these last 2 bullets, where you don't want people in the dark. You want everyone to have at least some understanding of where this fits in the broader picture, because that improves good design. That makes the design better. All right, the last 3 here. Whoops, the numbering is off. Yeah, this should be... Let's see if I can start at 10. There we go. I don't know how these got messed up. Okay, so the Agile principles, the last 3 here. Simplicity is essential. Essentially, we want to make sure that we are doing as much as possible to make the product as simple as possible. And this does take effort. Maximizing the amount of work not done takes effort because you have to actively identify the work, show that it is not actually necessary, and then remove it from the system in many cases. 11, best architects requirements and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. This, I think, is still very controversial. I've seen some research on emergent design, or the notion that test-driven development builds better software architectures, and it's still very much up in the air. I think in some cases it does, and in other cases it's mixed, and finally in some cases it clearly does not. It's very hard to know exactly what the relationship is here. And there's too many moving variables, too many confounding factors to be able to really do like a controlled study of this sort of thing. But just know that this is controversial and still included in many, many, many Agile processes. 12, at regular intervals, you have to reflect on the process itself and how the team is following it so that you can adjust your behavior accordingly. And we will see examples of that when we get into some of the later methods. I think Agile probably does this as a general rule better than waterfall development, but there's no reason that this should not be considered part of waterfall development. Again, remember the CMMI and this notion of measuring maturity predates the Agile software development process. Okay, so let's see. And then this is the last slide in this section, that Agile is very different from a plan-driven approach, a traditional approach like waterfall, spiral, what have you, in that you have much, much tighter cycles, right? You do have requirements analysis or requirements engineering, but the design, code, test, and fix phase is much shorter, and it's interwoven with the requirements phase, right? The customer would have to be involved for each of those requirements phases. So you can see here's requirements and the customer is involved in each of these throughout the life cycle. Okay. At some point, you may actually be able to rotate customers out. So for example, if this particular iteration is all on the user interface, you don't need the stakeholder that only deals with the back-end stuff, right? Or somebody who's not actually going to be using the user interface. You want the most appropriate customer in the room for that particular life cycle. Whereas for a plan-driven approach, everybody has to be in the room for all sections of requirements analysis, even if it's not exactly necessary for everybody to be involved. So there are some efficiency gains here. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other planning elements of Agile and why it works in the next set of slides.